One of the most common objections from critics of biblical polygamy is the belief that every time there was a polygamous household in the Bible, it resulted in problems. Every man that took on more than one wife ended up with struggles and turmoil. And it's from this resultant turmoil and scandal that the critics conclude polygamy must be wrong. They see it as proof that it must be sinful. But under this critique, the conclusion of polygamy being a sin is not drawn from any law or statute or prohibition. Rather, it's drawn from unspoken hints, so-called hints in the text, some kind of esoteric Gnostic reading of the Bible, which is a very weak argument to be making right out the gate. However, because of the popularity of this approach, I wanted to address it in this episode, since the texts I'll be going over directly contradict that very notion. But before I go through all those texts, I just want to point out that one doesn't have to think very long to see how faulty this reasoning is. For example, to conclude that polygamy must be wrong because it caused wives to be jealous is also the exact same reasoning to conclude that having more than one child must be wrong because it causes sibling rivalry or brothers and sisters to be jealous of one another. Now, I would encourage the listener to think a lot about that. There's a huge sinful assumption in that particular complaint. The complaint that whatever makes a woman jealous must therefore be the sin. So is God's law supposed to be interpreted on the basis of a woman's jealous nature? How is that not tyrannical? In fact, it sounds exactly like the kind of argument a jealous woman would make. But let me suggest something here. The jealousy a child experiences of his or her sibling, is it more than one sibling that causes jealousy? Or is it rather more that having a sibling, or more than one sibling, reveals the jealousy of the heart that was already there? That's a huge difference between those two things. Was the heart of mankind so pure that the having another sibling created a fresh new evil of sin and jealousy simply by having more than one child? No, we know that's not true. The disposition to covet, to be jealous, to hold grudges, to be selfish, all of it, it's already there in the heart and needs to be dealt with, right? It's my opinion that children who grow up with siblings tend to be more well-grounded and mature, both mentally and spiritually, than children who grew up with no siblings at all. And you can't deal with sins of your heart if they are never revealed, even to you. And siblings have a way of bringing those sins of the heart out into the open so that they can be dealt with. Kids who grew up with siblings, they have opportunities that only children never are afforded. But that's my own personal opinion. I don't want to veer too far off from the main point, which is that this critique against biblical polygamy is a sword that cuts both ways. I'm not going to stand here and say, look at all the turmoils and struggles and problems that monogamous marriages had in the Bible, because there's certainly a plethora of examples of those. I mean, Adam and Eve. Adam only had one wife, and they both plunged the world into sin. Talk about problems. Isaac and Rebekah. Isaac only had one wife, and yet that household was split in two. And because of jealousy, no less. Sibling rivalry. Jealousy between the siblings. I'm not going to argue against monogamy or against having more than one child just because of the example of Isaac and Rebekah. Nobody argues monogamy is wrong because of these examples of monogamous households. Because it's abject foolishness. Because they know it's abject foolishness. There's no such thing as a sinful human being, married or not, polygamous or not, that have no struggles with sin. Everyone has sin to deal with. Simply pointing that out is not a valid critique against biblical polygamy. But I want to show examples in the Bible where there were households of polygamy that were, generally speaking, not associated with problems and turmoil. Yes, every relationship has struggles to deal with, but I'm speaking in broad categories here. There are polygamous relationships that the Bible not only does not show any scandal thereunto, but that were associated with all kinds of blessings. That the Bible speaks of polygamy itself in a very positive light. In the book of Isaiah, chapter 3, Isaiah is giving a prophecy against the nation of Israel, because in verse 9 he says they have brought evil on themselves. Verse 16, the Lord said, because the daughters of Zion are haughty and walk with outstretched necks, wantonly gazing with their eyes, mincing along as they go, the Lord will strike with the scab the heads of the daughters of Zion. And in verse 25, he keeps on going, talking about all the sins that Israel has amassed, and the results of which, God says in verse 25, your men shall fall by the sword, and your mighty men in battle, and her gates shall lament and mourn, empty she shall sit on the ground. I'm just building up the context here for the very next verse in chapter 4, where after all of this condemnation and prophecy of punishment to be such a severe degree that many men will fall by the sword and die, that the resultant society after that will be, in verse 1, chapter 4 of Isaiah, 7 women shall take hold of one man in that day. In that day, meaning in that day after the punishment has been fully realized on Israel. In that day, the resultant society, 7 women shall take hold of one man in that day, saying, we will eat our own bread and wear our own clothes. Only let us be called by your name, take away our reproach. Verse 2 says, in that day where polygamy is rampant, where 7 women take one man, in that day, the branch of the Lord shall be beautiful and glorious, and the fruit of the land shall be the pride and honor of the survivors of Israel. You see, because God has purged evil from the land, such to the degree that so many men have died that each man has, in general, about 7 wives, and the wives want their reproach taken away. And God calls that society beautiful and glorious. Verse 3, and he who is left in Zion and remains in Jerusalem will be called holy, everyone who has been recorded for life in Jerusalem. I don't think that's a small matter, that a society is made up of men who have up to 7 wives. That's not a small matter of society. It's not just a parenthetical comment. And yet it's that society that God says they are the pride and honor of the survivors of Israel. That the branch of the Lord, Israel, in that day, after the evil has been purged, will be beautiful and glorious and even holy. I already covered Ruth in my episodes over Ruth, but I just want to touch on it as I pass by it again real quick, that in chapter 4, verse 11, the elders bless the marriage of Boaz and Ruth by saying, may the Lord make the woman who is coming into your house like Rachel and Leah, who together built up the house of Israel. And I tried to focus on that word together in that verse when I went over that episode, to say how that word together is intrinsically tied to polygamy. Because when it says Rachel and Leah together built up the house of Israel, what it's saying is together in marriage built up the house of Israel. Together in marriage to the same husband, aka Rachel and Leah, who polygamously together built up the house of Israel. And that resulted in blessings. The blessings that the elders are now trying to grant or bestow on to Boaz and to Ruth. Just another example where polygamy specifically, as it is denoted with that word together in that verse, is associated with blessings. And one more example to end off this episode. In 2 Chronicles chapter 24, verse 2, is an example of a man who had 2 wives, who, in general speaking, was not associated with scandal. At least his polygamous household was not associated with scandal, because chapter 24, verse 2 says, and Joash did what was right in the eyes of the Lord all the days of Jehoiada the priest. Jehoiada got for him 2 wives, and he had sons and daughters. Again, we all have struggles, married or not, polygamous or not, and I'm sure Joash had his struggles, but the Bible is speaking of him as doing what was right in the eyes of the Lord all the days of Jehoiada. And all the days of Jehoiada include Jehoiada getting him 2 wives, and he had sons and daughters. Those verses right next to each other are proof that the Bible does speak of polygamous households in terms that are just generally speaking not associated with scandal or turmoil. I would also encourage you to check out my last episode, not the last episode, but one of my previous episodes where I cover the verses speaking of David in particularly, the episode Defending David, where I try to show how so many people use David as an example of how polygamy was wrong, but they never actually read the texts because every text shows that the turmoil that entered into the house of David was due to his adultery and murder. Not once was it due to his polygamy. So I think it's faulty and wrong to suggest otherwise. So I know this was a longer episode. I went into a lot of depth over a lot of verses, and every single one of those verses, there can be much, much more gleaned from them. But for the purposes of this episode, I just wanted to show that the Bible associates polygamous households with blessings and, generally speaking, are not scandalous in and of themselves, which refutes the main, most common, and most popular objection to polygamy was that God put little esoteric hints in the texts to have us correlate the idea that polygamy caused problems and was therefore sin. But I think I've labored enough in this episode the faultiness of that reasoning and how the Bible itself pushes against it with all of these examples of polygamous households that were not scandalous. More than that, were blessings of themselves and resulted in blessings.